Hello church. Today I'm going to show you how to mix your dough, your sourdough dough, or just your sourdough. Once you have fed your starter and it is mature or ripe, which means it's fermented for anywhere from 7 to, I would say 12 hours is going to be a nice tangy fermentation. Then you're ready to mix with your other ingredients, salt, flour, water. That's all you need for sourdough. So let's take a look at our starter. This is my starter, Rosa. You can see Rosa is really bubbly, really fermented. That is lovely. Thank you, Rosa, for doing your hard work. So this is everything we need to create sourdough bread. Flour, water, I have sea salt, and our yeast, Rosa. Sourdough bread is just a whole bunch of variables. You can change, what ratio of whole wheat and bread flour you use. You can change the temperature of the water. Mine is about 92 degrees Fahrenheit right now, and you can do a range. I've seen anywhere from 90 to 95 recommended. But it depends on the climate. If it's in the middle of winter, it might do 96 degrees. If it's summer and your bread is fermenting super fast, change it to 90, maybe even 89 degrees. Salt, I use sea salt mainly for the texture. You can really use any salt, it doesn't matter. And then of course our faithful, reliable, resilient sourdough starter. So we're gonna add the water to the flour, and I'm going to leave the recipe for the ratios in the description of the video. Just pour it right in there, and first we're going to add the water and the starter and mix that up by hand. Don't add the salt yet. The salt actually slows down the fermentation process, and we want to give our dough kind of head start on fermenting. So now I'm going to scoop a little bit of Rosa into the bread. First, zeroing out my scale. This is actually a postage scale from Sam's Club that I use because I do really big batches of bread. But you can use any scale. And again, you're probably not going to be making as much bread as I am. This is a recipe for 2 large loaves that I got from Ken Forkish, the baker out in Portland. He wrote a book called Flour, Water, Salt, Yeast. If that sounds familiar, yes, those are the only ingredients you need to make sourdough bread. And now we're just going to mix up. This is now a mixture of our flour and our water and our yeast. And again, you want to get a good consistency. You don't want any dry flour left in your mixture. I'm using a food service bucket from Restaurant Depot. It's Cambro brand. It's a 12-quart bucket. Really, any mixing bowl is going to be just fine for you if you are baking at home. If you have a Pyrex with a lid that is airtight, even better. But I like these round buckets, and it's big enough for me to actually make enough dough for 4 loaves at a time in here. Or 6 of the small ones. Alright, so our consistency is looking great. And basically, my technique, you just kind of are like squeezing the dough with your fingers like that. So that's part of it. And the other part is kind of shoveling or scooping. And you want to kind of shovel and just fold the dough over on itself as you're mixing. And these early stages of the mixing, you're basically starting to work the gluten into the dough. The yeast is already starting to digest the new flour in the water and creating gluten. So now it's nice and stretchy. I'm gonna squeegee that dough off. Just put it right on top. It's pretty sticky at this point, but you will see as the gluten develops, it's going to be a lot less sticky and more springy, which is going to make a beautiful dough. Again, the reason I use my hands to mix this is hand mixed, naturally fermented sourdough dough, is get all of that healthy ecosystem going. Even when you wash your hands, just the fact that you're a living human being means that you have scores, millions of bacteria living all over your body, and that's nothing to freak out about. That's a good thing. We are part of a vast ecosystem of bacteria that do wonderful things for us and ask very little of us, and sourdough is one of those bacteria communities. I'm going to put my lid back on so it doesn't dry out. And I'm going to give it about 10 minutes before I add the salt and mix that in. Okay, before I add the salt, just a note on risk taking with bread. Bread is very low risk. Flour is very cheap. Water is very cheap. The yeast is literally just flour and water. And salt may be hard to find on the shelves right now, but salt is also very cheap. I have made dozens of mistakes as I've been baking bread in the past year or so. The worst thing that happens is your dough doesn't rise because maybe your water wasn't hot enough, or your sourdough starter was a little bit weak. It didn't have enough spring in the fermentation. The worst thing that happens is you end up making pancakes or scones instead of bread, and that's not so bad. So play around with it. How long do you want to wait for your bread to ferment before you add the salt? 10 minutes, maybe on the low end, maybe on the high end, 2 hours. And there's a lot of fluctuation you can play around with there. How hot do you want your water to be? Well, it depends on how warm your room is that you're baking in. And also how fast you want your bread to ferment. The warmer the water, the faster it will ferment and rise. So play around. There's a lot of room for variation, a lot of room for improvisation, which I love about baking sourdough bread. Start with a recipe and just, figure out what you like after that. Okay, so we've waited 10-15 minutes. Now we're going to add our salt. And again, wash your hands. And you're just going to mix it in with the same techniques, kind of lobster claw and the shovel. And here it's a little trickier than when you have the dry flour to mix in, because salt is just harder to see than dry flour, but basically you're trying to get salt into every corner of the dough as you're mixing it. And also, while you're going, this will save you some work later on. If you can kind of incorporate the dough off the sides of the bowl, you can almost, pull your dough and use it like a little rag. That's going to save you work later on. It'll give you more bread. Okay, so all the salt is mixed in. The next step is we're going to kind of fold the dough on top of itself and cover it and leave it to ferment for about 15 minutes. So the folding looks like this. You just grab a corner of the dough, pull it, fold it on top. You turn your bowl and do the same thing on another corner of the bread. And basically what you're doing is you're working the gluten, trying to stretch it to capacity. Don't pull it too hard. You don't want your dough to rip, but you do want to stretch it out so that your gluten is able to develop, and it just gets more springy the more you do that. So I want to rinse my hands, cover it up, and then we'll leave it for about 15 minutes and we'll come back and fold it.